Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Homes England Autumn Learning Programme. My name is Luke Callahan. I work in the Place, Partnerships and Capacity team here in Homes England. Today's event is adopting a place-led approach to design. This Autumn Learning Programme is brought to you by Homes England's Local Government Capacity Centre, and this slide summarises what the Local Capacity Centre are all about. Next slide, please. The Learning Programme is just one of the tools offered by the Local Government Capacity Centre. Our offers also include the Housing Information Hub, New Homes Fact Sheets, and a Capacity Analysis Tool. There are also a library of over 80 recordings on previous learning programmes available on YouTube, covering a range of different topics. Next slide. So on the screen, you will see a breakdown of the session today. You've already heard enough from me, and I am delighted to be joined by Hilary Satchwell and Katja Still from Tybalt's, who will be presenting the session today. We will be finishing with a brief Q&A session, and I will be drawing the session to a close with some further polls to get some immediate feedback. So if you could please both ask Hilary and Katja to come on camera, and I'll hand over to them to start the presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Luke. And it is an enormous pleasure to be here today and talk to you all about one of our favorite topics, place-led planning, design and placemaking. I'm Katja Stille, Director at Tybalt's, and today I'm here with my co-director, Hilary Satchwell. Between us, we will cover the disciplines of planning, urban design, master planning, architecture, and delivery. Next slide, please. So this is a quick overview of what we do and who we are. We are an interdisciplinary firm of planners, architects, urban designers. And we work on projects across all stages of the planning and development process, from policy formulation through to delivery on site. We work with private and public sector, and always with an eye on delivering positive and quality outcomes for the local communities. We support local authorities in bringing forward their policies or developments that they aspire to and that meet their wider objectives. And most of the time in collaboration with the communities and the wider stakeholders through carefully managed engagement processes. One document that you probably have seen and that you might know quite well, depending on your role in the local authority, is the National Design Guide, which we have co-authored with MHCLG at the time. Within today's presentation, we will focus on our work for local government, and all case studies are either local authority clients or Homes England in partnership with the local authorities. Most of these projects have been procured by the Homes England multidisciplinary framework, and you can still find us on it, and Lot 1 via Camberwreath and Lot 2 via directly to Tybalt's. So that's a brief introduction to us. So now let's get started with place-led planning. Next slide, please. The place-led approach really starts with understanding what constitutes a good place. And for us, it is a place that works well on all levels, where people can live healthy and happy lives, a place that supports sustainable lifestyles and helps to address environmental challenges. Place-led planning and design is certainly much more than just the appearance of buildings. And Hilary will dive into this a little bit more shortly. Next slide. To achieve a place-led approach and maximize the benefits that it can deliver, collaboration and partnership working is key. A single organization or a local authority department cannot achieve that on their own. And I mean, as we are talking about local governments, everybody in a local government has a role to play, ranging from the policy team to the maintenance team and the procurement team. Next slide, please. As an example of this, we have pulled out some local authority roles that are involved in delivering successful outcomes. And all of them, and many more that we haven't actually listed on the slides, should really work together towards a common goal. I mean, in simplistic terms, local plans and policies need to be setting the evidence framework for place-led development to come forward. And development management officers need to implement these policies and negotiate the right outcomes with applicants. And the council as landowner has an important role to play in terms of using public sector land and assets to achieve the identified goals and form partnerships with other developers and landowners. And we've also listed procurement because they are often an overlooked player. They need to make sure that the briefs and the evaluation requirements they set are appropriate to find the best partners for each individual project. And that is partners that might apply to the consultants you appoint, as well as the development partners, or even actually the maintenance and waste collection companies the council employs. All of these can either support or hinder the delivery of successful places. Next slide, please. A place-based approach will support the delivery of quality, provided it is done correctly. And the early stages are really important in this process. One has to obviously start with understanding the place. One has to know what is going on and where the existing issues and challenges lie. And what are the local aspirations? What does the community think? And what do other stakeholders are planning to do? For example, has the environmental agency earmarked funding for local flood improvements? Or is there a key landowner that is just about to sell a key site? This important contextual information is critical to maximize the benefits of every single project. And this is where collaboration and partnership working, listening and talking to people in the early stages is really, really important. A thorough understanding of the place will then inform the vision, and the vision should be widely supported by the community, the stakeholders and other public sector bodies and landowners. I previously mentioned that everybody should work towards a common goal, and this is it, the vision that everybody works together to deliver. If individual people pull in different directions or individual organizations, then the benefits won't be maximized. And there are a lot of benefits of a place-led approach. Not only that it usually delivers better quality, but it is generally supported through policy, and it also kind of builds support. If communities understand the benefits of certain projects or of developments, they're more likely to accept the change. In particular, if that change can be demonstrated that the proposals have been informed by local knowledge and shaped particular to address existing shortcomings. This understanding is very important to bring on board a wider kind of collaboration with the community and minimize objections. Next slide, please. So these are the broad steps in a place-led approach. And I don't really want to go into detail because there's a lot we want to talk about, but we can always come back in terms of questions. One thing to say is kind of, as I outlined, the understanding of place, then moving to the vision and the objectives. They will inform the proposal and then obviously delivery and implementation stages. It is really important at each of those stages to check back with the vision and the objectives, checking back whether we are still on track. Or sometimes during proposal stages or delivery stages, projects can get derailed. And actually kind of as other drivers like financial drivers become more important in the conversations, projects can kind of slightly miss their original targets and objectives. So it is really important that a successful place-led approach is iterative and based on ongoing learning. Next slide. So quickly and broadly and only lightly, kind of like really relating it back to some of the roles and responsibilities within the local authorities. I mean, we have the policy team that is setting the vision and is leading the definition of the vision and objectives in terms of how the place should develop. And this needs to be done in collaboration with all council departments, including the maintenance, the public health team, and the property teams. The development management officers, they have a role in almost policing the delivery of the vision through negotiations with applicants and enforcing the policies that will get you to the common goal. Housing and regeneration teams, are kind of coming on it often from another side and almost act as external developers as they prepare council-led development proposals or form joint venture partnerships with the private sector. And the focus will be slightly different potentially, with a concern on long-term maintenance costs and providing the best for the affordable housing tenants. And this is where maintenance teams come in. And they also need to inform the original vision and objectives, making sure that the buildings work in the long time and that the vision that you want to achieve endures many, many years. So before I go back to the case studies and drill into some of the examples, Hilary is going to unpack for us why place is important.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Katja. So I'm going to, as Katja says, take us through some issues around kind of the place-led design, reiterating some points about why we need it, why it's beneficial, and then some of the issues and topics that you'll come across in working in projects, so you can help think about the language and the questions you might ask when trying to get projects that you're involved in one way or another to be more place-led and basically to be better for the communities that will live around them. So what I really want to think about is how you, and in your different roles, how you'll shape, brief, lead, plan and support projects. So thinking about how does a project relate to its place? Where is it? Does it have a clear place-based vision? As you go through the process, as Katja said, is it delivering on that vision? And how does it relate to the needs of those that will live and work there and those that will pass by? These are questions, exactly as Katja said, to ask repeatedly through different stages. So let's think about some of the tools and language and principles we need to get through that process. If we go to the next slide, please. So I think we've talked about why we need place-led design, because it's about people, because it's about making a better development. But we also want to make sure that places stand the test of time, that we think about the needs and priorities of that place, not just your own or your department's priorities or the last person who shouted loudest. It's important that we have well-rounded places and projects, and that this supports community buy-in and acceptance. A clear vision for future place builds identity, helps you work out what and why you want the place to achieve, and it gives you something to test progress against. Are we meeting the vision we set out? So thinking a little bit about the people in a place, this really helps us think about the needs of different groups, because whatever it is we're proposing, what project, if it's housing growth, if it's a new library, whatever the project might be, there will be an impact on other people. And one of the things that we find very helpful is to think about those impacts in terms of specific user groups, specific types of people that might be impacted on, because it turns out that if we want to make really inclusive, rounded, functional places that work well for a lot of people, it doesn't necessarily work to think generically about everybody. What really works is to help think a bit more specifically about, for example, the needs of children and young people, the needs of older people, those who are more or less able-bodied, people with a range of backgrounds and income levels, and also not just those that will live there, those that are the future residents, but also those that will pass by, those that will walk along the street and kind of either feel that that new development, that place is part of their town, or something that feels a little bit alien. We also want to try and really kind of nail down this idea about what place is. I had a quite funny conversation with my 17-year-old son this morning when I told him about this talk, and he said, "Oh, place is just fake news, isn't it?" And I said, "No, actually, it's not." And he knows full well it's not fake news. He's in the middle of doing his geography A-level at the moment, and they're doing human geography, and he's having to go and think about place. And that's why he thinks it's fake news, because some of this is quite hard to think, how do I quantify this? How do I describe this place thing to people in a way that is easy to know that they will understand what I mean? And that's why we use principles, and I'm going to talk you through some principles in a minute. And that's why we want to make sure that we've got a set of language that we can kind of all share and use together to do this. So in terms of the next slide, just very briefly, before I get onto those principles, a little bit about process, which is just a lot of working with place, with communities, addressing local needs, is about the process of design. And one of the things that we often find happens is that a lot of people don't understand that design in making places is a process that goes from less detail, quite strategic, quite high level, to more detail, and that it can take a lot of time to do this and through lots of stages. Now, each of us in our different roles might only touch a project or be part of a project for one little piece of those stages. But I like to think of us and our role, or all of our role, yours and our role on a project, as being a custodian of it for that short time we're involved in it, be it as a strategic plan, be it in terms of delivering a brief for the detailed delivery of a custodian. So we leave the place-based vision for that development or that project in a better position after we've worked on it than we did before. And that's why the process feels important. So we've all got buy-in. So the thread of what we're trying to deliver carries on through. And whoever picks it up next doesn't just throw away or ignore or think there's nothing valuable that's gone on. And the clearer, the more clearly and the more articulately we can describe this, the easier it is for that to happen. Place, as Catch has described, is not a single discipline or a single sector task. We all need to collaborate and share in building that vision together and understand a place from those who know it. So that does mean talking to the community. One of the key things I think that makes thinking about quality in place even more important is higher density development. And we'll all be being pushed to deliver more homes, more density, additional things. And that just increases the pressure to make sure that we are always thinking about the place it's going to be in, the people that are going to use it, and the process we're going to use to make sure it gets delivered. I think this is often about pressure on ground level, street edges, activities, how we make sure those work well, what it's like to move around, building form and skyline, how does the new thing relate to other existing things around it, legibility and wayfinding, are we really providing the routes that allow people to cut through to the bus stop or to easily walk to school, and to make sure those things are fundamentally what we're doing and getting them in early. Safety, what it feels like for different groups and different people to walk around. These become even more considerations and even more important as we are moving into more pressure on development, more pressure on delivery. So making good places and place-led design isn't a fixed set of rules. It always involves judgment. We need to think about consistency over time, and we need to have a vision. We need to build a vision. We need to share a vision. We need to build other people into it. And I want us all to have a bit of confidence in doing that. Out of the conversation, we can think, what do we want this place to do? How do we want it to feel? How do we want people to enjoy it in the future? So if we go on to the next slide, I'm going to use the National Design Guide principles, which Katja introduced earlier, just to talk about some of the issues and some of the principles that help us thinking about place when we're thinking about delivery of housing or other development projects. The principles in the National Design Guide cover a really broad range of issues that I would say pretty much all projects one way or another have to deal with. They have to think about these things. There are the principles here, which I'm going to go through in a little more detail. But the other thing I wanted to think about is the three overriding factors in the National Design Guide, they're called the 3 Cs. And each of these different principles contribute to these really 3 important things that every project needs to have a view on. We need to think about how we're creating character, how we're thinking about the community. We might be thinking about the neighbours and the existing community. We're also thinking about how this forms a new community together, be it expanded, be it an additional building, how will it change the community? And really critically, for all of these principles, we need to think about the impact on climate. We need to think about places where it feels comfortable to spend time, buildings that work and are fit for the future and that are well located. So all of these things are the really overriding factors that I want us to consider. So if we now go through each of these principles in turn, so if we move on to the first one, which is context. So context feels like a really obvious place to start when we're talking about place-led design and place-led planning. Understanding the context is something that we all, I would hope, do when we're starting the project. Not only what's within the red line, but what's going on outside of the site. Mapping, what's the uses, What are the things that are missing from the area? What's our site trying to do? This is often where projects start, and it's a really critical thing to start with. It can also be a really useful way to start the conversations with the local community. What do they value about their place? What's the heritage that they think they really kind of defines their area or the locality? What's the history of the site? What's the things that we need to know as people working on projects? Where's the culture? Where's the sort of essence of this place, this context that we need to understand in what we're doing? And how can we write that into the briefs we put together? How can we make sure that informs the project? It's not just a stage that sits outside of that. Oh, yeah, we've done that. We've ticked that box. We've understood the context. Oh, and here's our site. We need to make sure that one feeds into the other. This doesn't mean to say that everything has to be exactly like the context, but we do need to have a very strong relationship to it. The next slide is about identity. Now, identity is a really important point here. And in place-led design, we can relate identity quite strongly to this idea of a vision. And identity doesn't necessarily tell us whether something has a particular style, but it does tell us whether we want it to respond to local character, whether we want it to feel like that existing place. Maybe we want it to feel different. Maybe we want it to be something that's a really strong change in the area that brings about something different, that enhances the identity. We also want to think about how we make sure that it's well designed, it has quality, and thinking about identity, making sure somewhere is attractive and distinctive. High quality is different part of that. Attractive is a kind of slightly weird one. It's a really good word, but we all know whether a building might be attractive or not. But saying in advance, I want my building to be attractive, is perhaps not the descriptor we'll use. But in a brief, you might say, for example, we want to think about how we're making attractive, well-considered design. And that would mean to your design team, you need to then talk through what you mean by that. That might mean we want people to like it, but does anyone go about trying to build buildings people don't like? However, we still do end up with quite a lot of buildings people don't like. So there's clearly something slightly missing in some of the conversations we have around that, and in some of the things around project briefs. I think it's perfectly good and quite a nice thing in project briefs to be writing about wanting strong identities, wanting to think about local character, and using qualitative words to describe the vision and the aims of a project, not just, oh, well, I want this many houses and they need to be viable, or this. We want to talk about how we're building that vision, how we're relating it to the existing identity, how we're building a new culture and identity. I think it's also important to think about the relationship to the local area. Is this intended to be a landmark project? Is it going to be highly visible? Is it on a really important ridgeline? Or actually, is it very subtly built into the landscape? All of these things can be perfectly valid responses to a different site or question. There is no right or wrong answer. There's a question of forming a judgment through conversations, through discussions with people, to reaching a view, describing what that view is, and trying to get everyone to then say, okay, are we happy that this is our vision? This is the identity we're looking for of this place. The next slide is about built form. Now, built form actually is a really important aspect of place, because the shape and form of buildings really changes how they sit with other buildings, how they sit with other areas. It's not just scale and height, but it's also about whether we're trying to make buildings feel really spread out, whether they're gathering them into all one part of the development. How do we make sure that we are balancing the needs of buildings with the needs of open space, things like biodiversity, net gain? They don't seem like they're related, but how we choose to relate our buildings to each other and the shape we make them affects how we view them in the skyline. It affects how they look as a group together and how they sit with their context. So built form is really important. And related to this, urban form, the shape and connections we make of building blocks, whether we're continuing a street, whether buildings will continue a line. You might have a terrace of streets. Are we going to continue that? Are we going to do something different? Whether we decide to join our buildings together or have lots of separate buildings changes built form, it changes the character, it changes the identity. It can also have a key role to play in making really sustainable and climate-friendly buildings. Generally, the rule of thumb is that you want to think about minimising surface area. So there's a sort of surface area to volume ratio, but actually that can also make really quite bulky buildings. So you have to think quite carefully about this. The way we use built form can also really make something really stand out or feel something that feels quite subtle and built into the landscape. In terms of urban form, if we move on to the next slide, urban form is very closely related to movement. And the really key thing about movement is this isn't just a thing that can be applied at the end. I really want everyone to think about how we start planning out sites and projects by thinking about urban form and movement from the very beginning. If we want people to move around easily, people will generally choose routes where it feels good, it feels safe, it feels pleasant to walk around, it feels overlooked, it's a route that feels convenient and attractive. People will often walk a little bit further to walk along the nice route than the not so nice route. So good links and connections are critical. They're also really critical in supporting people having travel choice, thinking about how we get to active and sustainable travel to work and building those things in. Sometimes when you go back and look at developments, and we've done projects, we've reviewed existing developments, and you find someone just missed a piece of pavement in a key location that kids are walking along all the time, for example, to get to school. So thinking, as I said earlier, about what specific groups need, always think about connections in and out of sites, trying to make seamless links and connections to the wider area, understanding where the community think the good links are. That is, again, relating it back to the place, what the needs of the place are. I want us to think very carefully about kind of parking, servicing, utilities, all those very functional, technical things. But if we don't get them in the right place, they can block how we want people to move around. They can be poorly located. It can mean that it's actually easier for someone to get in their car and just drive somewhere, because even though the shop might be 5 minutes away, actually getting there involves walking on a route that they don't feel safe using. So understanding that place, understanding how people want to use it is really important to make sure that movement and wider connectivity is built in from day one. And what I would say is, when we're laying out sites, when we're thinking about strategies, when we're thinking about even smaller sites and master plans, get your movement in early and think about the movement for those who most need the most direct routes first, and build in those who can cope with a little bit of moving around a little bit further, i.e. private cars, sort of last. Plan that in. Don't draw your road as the first thing that you do. Think about where you want the design lines, the movement to be. The next slide is about nature. And nature and greenness and high quality open space is really important for thinking about place. People really value green space, proximity to open space. And sometimes it'll be the thing that they feel like they're losing when we're putting projects together. But we can definitely bring more. We can definitely provide new open spaces. We can make sure that we think about people's access to nature. Some large scale master planning projects we've worked on, existing communities have said to us, the problem is that I want to get over there to go and walk my dog, but actually I can't get over this busy road, or there's some other issue. And we can think through delivering the project how we can also help that existing community's access to nature. Projects have to deliver, as I said before, biodiversity net gain. We have to think about how we're making places people really enjoy, and building this in, again, is important. Addressing local shortfalls is a way to have that existing conversation with the local community about what's there and what's not there. Are there play facilities that you'd be better off upgrading or moving onto the site? It's understanding what's there, it's rooting it in that place, and it's thinking about what we can do. We're having to do a lot of work around kind of surface water drainage and flood risk, and thinking about how this works in relation to nature. And this, again, builds really kind of positive features of place that local people appreciate, they understand, and leads to better acceptance of projects as a general rule. The next slide is about public space. So this is about where we're thinking about how we bring people together. It might be streets, it might be squares, it might be more formal space. but it's places where we're suggesting people can convene, they can do things together, how they can let their children out to play, how we can make sure that different users can use that space, and encouraging social interaction. Sometimes these might be kind of fairly quiet spaces that are quite tranquil, otherwise really busy. Nice words for briefs are around whether you want the spaces to feel very vibrant, whether you want them to feel very calm. Think about the qualitative words about the spaces that you're trying to create. How do these complement and sit with places and spaces and public spaces that already exist in the context, in the area that you're working in? And how can you really add to that dynamic? One of the examples, one of the key things to think about in terms of public space, particularly streets, is front doors, entrances, making sure people can come and go easy. And we're thinking about how the communities understand what does it mean for them if I'm going to be walking along this street? What will make me want to use these spaces? If we move on to the next one, I'm just aware that we've got quite a lot of these to get through. The next one is about uses. Now, what's important about uses is this is really what we put where. What goes on at the ground floor? How do we make sure things are active? And one of the ways we often approach this in terms of thinking about place-led design is what's missing in the surrounding area? What works well in the surrounding area, but what's missing? What could this project contribute that would help local people, but would also provide something different and not compete with what's there already? Serving existing communities really well helps the conversations you can have with people and helps you move on in terms of what you're trying to do. We also need to think about how we make sure these uses cover a range of different people's needs and not just for a small group of people. In terms of place, so this example on the bottom left here is quite an interesting one. In Telford, it was part of the Bournemouth Village Trust created a new community on the edge of Telford. One of the things that that everyone agreed would be nice to do would be to have some kind of cafe pub type thing. It wasn't necessarily where the Bournemouth Village Trust started and what they thought, but they said here, no, if its function is going to be to bring the community together, it's definitely something we should do. And this square has a pub and cafe on it, it has a school on it, it has a space for different activities, and it's really just a collection of where all the streets join. So it's kind of bringing all of those things together. So how can we integrate and deliver those things in a positive way? And the next slide is about homes and building, which I think. So this, in a way, this slide, this principle in the guide is more about internals, but I think in place-led design, this might lead us to think about what's the mix and type of homes that are needed here. What's missing in the local area? What type of place is this and why might we need them? There's a key aspect of sustainability. And there are other very functional things to think about, like actually, how are we going to locate all of the services? It drives me mad when you go into a new place and the substations are the most visible thing you see. Like, I understand why that's a difficult thing to achieve, but let's think about it early and try and locate these things well. So it doesn't feel that you're having to kind of drive past the standard thing before you get to the really exciting part. This is also kind of a thing that lots of communities and lots of the people that we talk to find it quite easy to understand, talk about, and to have conversations about. So it's really something interesting to involve people in those conversations. The next slide is about the principle around resources. We do need to use resources efficiently. We need to make sure that buildings, places, spaces are resilient, largely to do with climate. But it also helps to think about actually the selection of materials in terms of how they relate to the locality. How do we make sure something feels as if it's part of its context, but also thinks about these other issues about long-term, their long-term impacts, the construction techniques, how can we make sure that they feel special, that there's something very interesting going on, that we're using craft, that we're using detail to make them feel like they're part of that place. That doesn't tell us anything about particular styles of building. All buildings can do this, but it starts to tell us about things that have detail, that will last a long time, and that are also efficient to use. The next slide is related to this, which is about lifespan, and it's really important that we're thinking about making buildings that last. wherever it is we're thinking about our place-led projects being, there will already be mostly existing buildings, existing structures, and we can think and respond to those. They've been there generally for some time, and we want new places to feel seamlessly part of the local area. They might not be exactly the same, but they're part of it. We need to think about management and maintenance, which is less about place, but people will notice very quickly if one part of the place feels like it's run down, not working, feeling if it's not being looked after, and the sense of ownership, the sense of people caring about something is a real thing that will support future place and how places work in the long term. So that is the end of all of those principles from the National Design Guide, and hopefully it's given you a little bit of the language and the tools that we use to describe place against those principles. They're a pretty good set of principles. Even if in putting a project brief together, you thought about what do we want to do in relation to all of these principles, it would be a good place to start. So just to summarise the benefits of place-led design in relation to those principles. So we've really found, and we think it really helps in creating additional value and social value related to the needs of the place. Helps to build local support in that it shows people you've understood, respected and responded to their place. Arguably better at levering in additional economic benefit by responding to local issues and needs, by being less generic in terms of design and more specific in terms of wanting something that has a clear identity. We need to respond to and build in accordance with an understanding of technical and local constraints and challenges. And I think we would strongly say it's about being more cost effective in the long term, because you've got building and places you might have to spend a little bit more on now, but in the long term, actually they last longer, people care about them more, and they provide additional benefit. I'm now going to hand back to Katja, who's going to take you through some examples of projects that have used these principles or principles like this.
Thank you very much, Hilary. We've put together a series of projects and case studies that we believe contain some useful learning points and illustrate the points that Hilary has made on practical examples. And as I mentioned before, all of these are public sector projects. And we also are keen to show a variety of projects, from policy to development projects, planning and master planning. And these type of projects could happen within each local authority, and similar ones might actually be currently underway where you're working. And I think all of these also kind of need support from the wider local government and public sector organizations. So next slide, please. So this slide is really illustrating that a place-led approach is valid for projects taking place within existing urban contexts, as well as for the creation of new communities. On the left-hand side, there's an example, a drawing of a estate regeneration project, where the new development not only delivers new homes, but it also mends an existing form. After having conversations with the community and listening to the issues about unsafe routes or kind of missing routes and connections, space that is left over and uncared for, this project really identified opportunities of placing new buildings and new spaces to create streets and spaces that feel much safer, that are better connected, more legible, and thereby, although the project was motivated by housing delivery, it actually also creates an urban form and an urban strategy that is based by the place analysis and the community engagement to create a safer and more legible and attractive place for the people living there already. On the right-hand side is a master plan for a new neighborhood of around 4,000 homes on a former MOD site. And the structure and urban form of this new neighborhood and its future character has been very heavily influenced by the site heritage. By, for example, the alignment of the runway, by the planting that was planted at the time when it was an airfield, but also by the landform and the connections that were there before it came an airfield. Because often when we look into heritage, we need to go back several steps and not just to what was immediately before. So in this particular case, there used to be a lane, a traditional lane that connected two villages. And that lane and those villages had been there for a very, very long time. The airfield then severed this connection, making it difficult for people to move from one village to another. So one of the key moves in this master plan is to reinstate that connection. And for the first time in many centuries, actually allowing direct connections again between those villages. So this is one way how master plans, estate regeneration projects, frameworks, they can all mend existing fabrics and existing places and provide a greater benefit to the wider community beyond that kind of tight red line that we sometimes draw around our projects. Next project is for East Devon Council. Yes, thank you very much. And here we are currently developing a vision and a master plan framework for a new town. And we are supporting East Devon Council and supporting their local plan and the Reg 18 and 19 consultations. And from the outset, it was very clear that this project had to learn from past mistakes and shortcomings and really address issues that the community had raised with previous attempts of building a new town. And those comments were built around sustainability of the new place, but also in terms of phasing. In another development, the infrastructure and local center weren't delivered until many of the houses were built. This is unfortunately something that is quite common across the country. And this was an issue and a concern highlighted by stakeholders and the community. And the local authority was very clear that this time it needed to be happening differently. So from this very early conceptual work, we have been thinking about delivery and phasing of facilities. And while it might not look very fixed in this way because it is a very conceptual diagram, but the location of the local centers and the town centers have been identified so that they can be delivered early and some facilities can come forward early when there are only a few houses. And that the phased approach can be taken by, for example, making sure that the early facilities can draw on existing employment users in the area, park and rides, and other kind of communities and groups that can use those facilities to make sure they're viable from very early on and that the emerging community doesn't have to wait for a long time. Also looking early on is, we know that for a town of this size, around 8,000 homes, that we may need around 25 hectares of ground-mounted PVA to make that happen, to meet the zero carbon objectives. So what does that do to the land budget? Where do we place those? And is that desirable in which areas? So from very early on, again, looking at those kind of land budgets, considerations that we can make sure we are following through with the vision from early concept through to delivery. Next project, please. So this one, I might skip over that a little bit because I've mentioned it already. This is the new neighborhood on the MOD airfield, which reinstates the kind of broken link between the villages. And I mean, it's very much conceived as a healthy new town, and it is drawing on that heritage character, the runway lake. And on the sketch, you can probably imagine where the runway lake used to be. In the new master plan, it is broken into several different characteristics, starting in the north from a big, huge new lake into a neighborhood park, the center, and then a kind of avenue kind of leading out to the south. So all of those elements are creating the character for the future for this place and making sure it's memorable and based in its heritage as well. The next project is one where we are working with Homes England in partnership with the local authority, Tendring Council. And this is an urban extension to Clacton-on-Sea. And while it is kind of delivering a new neighborhood, it is delivering new homes, it also has a very important part to play in terms of the regeneration of the wider town. And the early studies and analysis has demonstrated that actually the neighborhoods and the communities immediately surrounding of the site had a severe lack of access to open spaces, playing fields, play areas. And that was very clearly identified through these analysis documents, plans. So as part of the master plan, one of the key moves was to locate the new open spaces and the play areas, a destination play area, within close proximity to the existing communities so that they have direct access, close access and convenient routes and safe routes to those new facilities. And by looking beyond the red line, almost starting the project with ignoring the red line, you kind of can identify these shortcomings that can be addressed through the work as it goes along. These are added benefits that help the existing communities to also accept the change because there is a direct benefit for them. Next one, please. This is one where the local authority, Chichester Council, is working with a parish authority, and they are kind of together identifying the growth for the village of Southbourne. In the local plan, the local authority has identified a broad area for development, an area that is much bigger than needed to deliver the housing numbers. So it pretty much kind of goes around the whole of the village. And the purpose of that was that the areas identified in which development could come forward. And then a later stage, the site allocation, DPD, that is working, developed together also and in collaboration with the parish community, is to identify exactly where that growth goes. So in the project that we are doing at the moment, we are refining those boundaries and we are identifying exactly where the home should go, where the open space should go, and what are the benefits and the connections to this village. 2 weeks ago, as part of the REC 18 consultation, we presented 3 scenarios for growth to the local community, and all of them have different benefits and challenges. So once we have received that feedback, we will identify a preferred way forward and then kind of the draft DPD for the REC 19 consultation. The community in Southbourne has understood that this process of proactively planning for growth will help them and the local authority to push back on speculative developments, because those are not contributing to the delivery of the local services, making, in this case, the railway crossing safer, providing new community facilities. Because the residents within the village have understood that the village is growing, but the services are not keeping pace. So by proactively planning together, the community has a much better control over what is happening to their village and can ensure that actually the services are delivered. Next one, please. This is an authority-wide design code for Bradford that has been prepared to support the emerging local plan policy. And this looks at creating high-quality urban neighborhoods and addressing existing challenges in terms of health inequalities, for example, a particular high rate of child obesity. Bradford has a very young population and areas of high deprivation. So the design code is specifically tailored to address these specific challenges and to ensure that the homes provided provide quality for the community, but also address some areas of deprivation. This is an example where the place-led approach has drawn on particular health statistics and deprivation indexes to inform the design policy. One example of how place-led approaches can really bring together all the different departments as well to kind of make that change happen. Next slide, please. This is one example we wanted to raise as an example of partnership working. This is taken from a town centre framework for Salisbury. And in that work, we identified an opportunity to create a large open park running through the center of the town. So there were lots of bits of cycle routes, bits of space, but they were all fragmented and didn't hang together. So by creating and identifying this opportunity for the large central park and that kind of connectivity from the north to the south, it really allowed us to address a number of very specific points in terms of identifying wider benefits, such as addressing kind of access to green space within the town centre, providing active travel routes to the surrounding residential neighbourhoods, making sure people have a convenient and easy way into the town centre, as well as creating an attractive setting for future development and thereby raising values and ensuring kind of making viability considerations easier. While we were identifying this opportunity, the Environmental Agency had identified the need for flood mitigation works within Salisbury. And through a partnership between the Council and the Environmental Agency, they pooled their resources and together started delivering the park as set out in the strategy. So it's now not just flood mitigation works, but also it kind of becomes a new green space. So through this partnership and the collaboration, it made public sector resources go much further, and it delivered added benefits to the town beyond flood protection or beyond access to green space. The next one is also a town centre project, and this one is located in Bracknell. Bracknell is one of the post-war new towns, and while it has undergone a lot of transformations in recent years, its new town legacy remains partly in a highway-dominated environment, particularly as you approach the town centre from the station, but also from the northern areas. And this particular case study is to kind of show how, again, by looking beyond wider than your kind of immediately red line, we will identify not just a mixed-use development and deliver additional homes and commercial space, but actually benefits in terms of creating a much larger open space within the town centre, a space that was missing, so a place for markets and events and the community to come together, but also creating a really good link between the station and the town centre. And that was by identifying another open space that was on the periphery, which was not very well used, and relocating that. Not only created it a direct link into the town centre, a new open space, it also allowed us to retain existing mature trees and also reclaiming some highway verges, narrowed some carriageways to bring that land back into better use, maximizing development potential and also creating better connections. So it's again, this place-led approach is looking beyond the immediate context and delivering wider benefits. Next one, please. So this is a project that is where we are acting as planning consultant, helping York deliver its ambitious housing program. City of York is using its own land to deliver affordable housing and is going far beyond the minimum standards by taking a longer-term approach. As the city has a long-term interest in affordable housing, is really keen to also reduce monthly bills for their tenants and also focus on the long-term sustainability and also management and maintenance cost. So by taking that long-term approach and looking at their own property assets, York is delivering a really ambitious program of housing on infill sites, on small sites, on garage sites, and really pushing forward with their kind of almost passive house standards, making sure that actually their residents and their tenants have lower bills in the future, and also ensuring that their own maintenance bills are lower. And I think the last project I want to mention is Bourne Estate, This is very similar to an earlier regeneration project I mentioned. It is about mending a fragmented urban fabric through careful infill development and regeneration. And that has added the value kind of to the whole area, not only to the new residents, but also to the existing by addressing community concerns about safety, connectivity, and delivering those wider benefits. Next, please. So on all of these projects, we have adopted a place-led approach to planning and design. And this approach leads to the delivery and can lead to the delivery of added value by creating wider benefits, but also bringing people along with you and explaining where the added benefits are for the community, creating wider buy-in where possible, and also by creating a very clear vision and a place-specific justification for these projects. So what can everybody do? So going back, next slide, please, to the beginning. Just briefly going back where we started, saying everyone has a role to play in this process. Often this might be a role of asking the right questions, asking questions of your colleagues, of your consultants, asking the question of the applicants and the delivery partners. Have they done the work to really analyze and understand the local place? Have they looked beyond the red line, and are there wider benefits that can be delivered? So in summary, the learning takeaways from this place-led approach is very much that it can minimize resistance to change. And if one has understood the place and talked to the community and stakeholders in particular, that is where a partnership approach with the community in collaboration starts. Have we set the vision and the objectives, and are they widely supported and understood? So is everybody pulling in the same direction and not kind of like following their own objectives? Looking beyond the immediate project boundary for the wider opportunities, and then seeking partnerships. That is very, very critical in this whole approach. Next slide, please. And this is very much where we are ending. I think we've talked enough, so it's over to your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you both. Really interesting presentation there. So like we said there, we're going to move now into a short Q&A session. So we've selected some of the most popular questions that you've put in the chat during the session that we're going to ask Katja and Hilary. So I can see you both got the cameras back on, ready to go. So we'll get started. A lot of questions coming through around climate, design, stewardship, identity, and then there are a few project specifics. So for the first one, in your opinion, what does the government need to do to ensure that a focus on housing delivery doesn't worsen design outcomes?
Yeah, I think this is a really good point, and is something that I know quite a lot of people are worried about. I would say that the potential changes that have been consulted onto the NPPF still are really clear that we need well-designed places and well-designed buildings. And there's nothing to indicate that that's going away or going anywhere. There is a very strong focus on numbers, but there's also a lot of people really reinforcing and making the case for place. They could make case for quality, because if we don't deliver good places that work over the long term, we're just putting a sticking plaster over a problem rather than solving it properly. And we also really need to think about climate, and the climate response at kind of strategic policy level, at national level, is not really yet strong enough and needs to be much clearer and much more consistent. And I would say is something that is still a bit of a gap that is waiting to be filled. But quality of place, quality of response to climate change, to climate impacts is critically important in delivering the numbers, and delivering one without the other isn't going to actually properly answer the question. So I would just say we should all keep pushing for those things and all keep working on the basis that we need all of them, all of that to be delivered, and you can't just do numbers, just doesn't work. I don't think that's what's meant, but I think sometimes that's how it comes across.
Yeah, and then perfect segue. You mentioned thinking more about climate change. So, what can we do, or even where do we start if we are planning for a rural area with poor public transport and many settlements have limited services?
I think this is a question that almost, I think, a local authority can't solve on its own. I think we really need to kind of think strategically about the places and where do we need to make connections, where do we need to deliver growth. And I think there's also often there's a particular resistance to locate new development within villages. And I think it's an understanding and a very open and honest conversation as well with those communities that through some growth, also facilities might be enabled and connections can be made in terms of strategic connections, in terms of better, bus connection and so on. But I think on a village by village basis, that can be solved. That needs a kind of strategic view on where we are placing infrastructure, where we are making strategic connections. I mean, the example of Cambridge, I know Cambridge is a kind of particular case, but a big strategic kind of business case did put in the bus link that connected towns that previously didn't have public transport link. That was partly linked to growth and a new town, but it did link different towns and villages as well. So I think it needs a strategic solution as well as an open and honest conversation with the villages themselves about potentially accepting some growth to create the facilities and make facilities viable.
I mean, also, I think there's one other point, which is that not everywhere is the same. We should ideally be promoting housing growth in the most sustainable locations, but sometimes smaller scale growth in other places is needed, and not everywhere can be as equally well served. But that should be a small proportion of what we're delivering rather than the majority of it, because it has other reasons why it's a good thing to do. And it's important we don't inadvertently come about by providing a lot of our housing numbers and growth in those locations. But sometimes that's what villages need, and on the back of it, they can get some improvement, but they can't ever they won't ever have the same connections as anywhere else. But maybe at as a small percentage, that's okay.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Staying on that same vein, how do you ensure, you might have touched on this in your earlier answer and in your presentation, but how do you ensure that climate change is given proper attention and significance, given that it spans across everything but isn't called as a principle in its own right?
I mean, I think the National Design Guide, I think that's one of the points about it. So it's an overriding, I don't want to reuse the word principle, but it's an overriding consideration that should be through everything. It isn't something that's one small point in a long list of things. Everything needs to respond and have a kind of clear response to climate. I think we can all see how important that is. It's important that we're thinking about flooding. It's important we're thinking about insulation, overheating, orientation, all of those things, all through that. So it just becomes a second nature part of our thinking rather than something that has to be additional as one short thing on a list. So it has to be one of the priorities that really runs through all of this work and all of the work we do in thinking about place. I'm not sure does that quite answer the question, but yes.
It's a tough question, to be fair, so you done well.
Don't want to be ignored.
Exactly. So this one around identity. So how do you deal with multiple different identities in one area and incorporating them all into a design?
Well, maybe the answer there is not to incorporate them all into the design. It's to respond to the fact that you've got difference, and maybe the varying character should be something that again responds with another different thing that maybe relates to in a different way. It may be that you can be consistent in terms of the way it's dealing with building lines, for example, or boundary treatments, but different in the way that the buildings look. Maybe one of the intrinsic qualities of that place is that this is made up of all sorts of different things, and that your job isn't to try and be the thing that makes them all feel the same as each other, but the job is to provide something else that feels comfortable with that difference, perhaps. That might be the way I think about it.
Yeah. I was also thinking, I was partly reading the question in terms of identities of people, and the kind of the elderly, the young people, everybody has slightly different needs possibly. And I always find that if we look at designs and our projects through the lens of the particular vulnerable kind of sectors of our population, like for example, if we would design most places for kind of 12-year-olds and children, then they usually make really good places for adults as well. So I think it's kind of considering certain groups in our community and letting them kind of lead the projects to a certain extent.
Great, thank you very much. So moving more towards project-specific questions here now. So a lot of the examples are large-scale interventions which lend themselves to a master planned approach. However, most places grow incrementally with smaller sites delivered by volume house builders. Do you have any good examples of how placemaking has been applied to these typical developments?
Yeah. I think this is a really good question. So lots of these are big projects, they are very strategic sites, but lots of the principles about thinking in advance about what you want somewhere to do and not just waiting for developers to come along and do the minimum is something that I would definitely say is the place to start. Smaller sites, you can think about links and connections, you can think about what's important, you can start the conversation with the local community, you can hold the developers to account to do that. I would say it's pretty much always a good idea to have an idea for yourself about what you think is important about a place and to have those early conversations with the developers to establish that you want quality here from the start. I understand that that is often a difficult thing to do and there'll be a lot of other pressures and they'll all be telling you that they can't afford those things. But our experience of that what we've seen is that the clearer and stronger you are about wanting good quality and wanting good places, the more likely you are to get it.
Yeah, to add to that, I would say that the kind of stages and the approach is pretty similar. And I think it's asking the developers and holding them to account to go through those stages. Because every site has existing features and characteristics. And too often we see that important hedgerows, topography, trees, connections aren't really taken on board in the early stages of the master plan, and asking the developer to draw a concept and a vision. What do they want to achieve? It's not just about delivering housing. That place has to have an identity. And even with the standard volume house builder typologies, you can create character by arranging them in a certain way, making connections, creating townscape features, for example, by grouping those buildings. So I think it's kind of really making them do this early work. House builders like skipping over that. They like skipping over the analysis and the character analysis and the vision and the concept. But I think making them do it and holding them to account to that, because often that is being lost as soon as, often it's a lovely hand-drawn sketch of this is the vision, and then when people draw the housing layout, you can't find anything anymore in that housing layout. So go back to what they said they would do and then tell them how they've done it.
Great, thanks a lot. Another one based on a specific project. So who is delivering those facilities early on at the East Devon New Town, as developers will not provide them until much later in the build?
There's a number of questions that I've seen being asked in the chat about kind of delivering things early. And I think it is a real challenge in that everyone starts off with the idea that we want these things early and then often they slip back. But this is where councils, local authorities, public sector needs to be clear that in the phasing, we need this infrastructure early. We need these things to come along at a reasonable timescale. With bigger strategic sites, in some ways that's slightly earlier, because early might still be after 1,000 homes, whereas with smaller sites that's quite difficult to do. We have got to be clear what we want and why we want. And this is where there's one of the proposals about kind of stewardship, thinking about actually what it is we're here to do. The success criteria isn't that we've designed some homes, that we've designed a strategy. The success criteria is that it's a great place to live, and that we need to get everyone buying in to what's needed to make that happen. Sometimes that does mean people have to accept their return, comes later down the line, but we need to be structuring development, structuring phasing that delivers things when we need. I also completely understand that there's lots of funding challenges, but even the bits that the public sector might deliver, it's really, really hard to get anyone to be at all clear about what they might be able to do on health on a site or on schools and when those can be delivered. But we all have to keep pushing for what seems to be the best balance between what can be delivered and what someone is able to do. So they might want it to be then, but actually they'll bring it forward with a conversation and understanding about that. But equally, we all have to understand too that that might affect the viability in the short term, and it might mean that some of the other things come later. So I think there are some conversations to be had. But again, this is where thinking early, deciding what you want, saying that building this as a community, supporting the village is critical. It's part of your policy, it's part of your guidance. It's then easier to make sure that you can insist upon it as you get through the later discussions.
In particular for East Devon, I mean, the local authority is now considering, development corporations, and various at the moment is going through the stages of testing and exploring different delivery options where they might have more influence and power than with the usual kind of developer-led approach. But I think it is that looking where the local authority and what the right delivery mechanism is to contain or retain some of that control. But it is also in the master plan and the phasing. For example, you can identify or know very early on what are the likely areas where you would start developing a strategic development. And that is probably not the place to put your town centre, because the town centre won't be viable very early on because the footfall and the people just aren't there. And nobody is going to build a town centre if there is nobody to use it. So it is about identifying potentially a more localized centre, temporary facilities early on that can draw on existing users, such as an employment area nearby. In this case, there's the airport, there's potential employment nearby. So they are building on existing users and starting small and acknowledging that the town centre, maybe the future heart of this development, or the big centre will come later. And also offering opportunities for the developers that will come on board to start building housing in one area while other areas wait for the footfall and the community to be there. So it is really looking at phasing and trying to maximize the existing community and population that is there, but also thinking about a meanwhile approach. Because a town centre, a local centre doesn't happen overnight, but that doesn't mean the community has to be left without services and facilities for a long time.
Perfect. Thank you very much. I had the last question teed up around stewardship and everything there, so you may have just have answered it. But if there's anything else to add on stewardship, overcoming maintenance issues, if not, we can draw the Q&A to an end.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was one of the early questions in the chat. I think the stewardship point is important, and definitely on big strategic sites and in boroughs and districts that we're working with, where they're really pushing for a stewardship approach. It is making a difference to what people are hearing. And what that really means is that communities are endowed with some facilities that gives them some income that helps manage the place. And it must be true that those closest to the place, those benefiting from the management and the maintenance, are also the most likely to make sure that it happens if they're in a position to do so and can afford to fund that. So there is a kind of circularity about a proper stewardship-led approach, which brings benefit. Appreciate it probably works best on larger scale projects, but getting community ownership, getting the community to buy into something and to feel that they care about how it looks, that they care about how it's looked after, and that things are designed to be more easily maintainable than others, it is really critical. One of the projects we just talked about before it was at the kind of early brief stage, we asked the client, what's your maintenance requirements? What's your maintenance brief? They'd really not built much themselves for a very long time, so hadn't thought about it. So we had to approach it with it, right, what's the lowest maintenance realistically we can plan for in this project? Because whatever we say it's going to be, probably there won't be the resources to do that. So we'll have to keep it as tight as possible. So kind of always thinking, what's the minimum we can do, and asking questions about it, even when it feels as if it's something that there might not be an attitude to yet.
Yeah, I mean, just to add to that, I mean, I think often it is, as Hilary mentioned, it's almost easy to say, oh, we deal with that later. But actually, later is too late, because, I mean, also when we design street spaces and so on, we need to talk adoption, we need to talk, bring everybody around the table, because otherwise we will never deliver on the aspirations that were said earlier, and that will lead to frustration in the community and all the partners involved, because the project doesn't meet its aspirations. So trying to do it later is unfortunately not an option. I mean, people need to come around the table very early on.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot. I think given the time, we'll draw the Q&A to a close there, and finish up with some final messages and feedback. So if we get the slides back up, please. And a big thank you once again to our speakers, Hilary and Katja. So this slide provides some take-home messages and resources that you'll find useful beyond the session today. As I said at the beginning, we'll be sharing a copy of the slides, so no need to rush to take down notes, but hopefully you will find some useful tips and links for you to use going forward. So that concludes the session today. Thank you once again to our speakers, Hilary and Katja, and to all our attendees for your input throughout the session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.